Hello dear friends, you are on the Ruslan Belov channel, and this is the daily summary of military operations from the Ukrainian front. Well, yesterday Zelensky announced that Ukraine is ready to fight for another 2 to 3 years. You know, it's not surprising. There's no need to hold elections. They are given money. They are given weapons. No one is trying to close the issue with him. No one is hunting him. Well, why not fight then for another 2 or 3 or 30 years? The fighting on the front continues, and we continue to study the situation with you. Let's open the map. So friends, today we will divide the episode into 2 parts, as there are 2 topics for discussion. First, Putin heard a report from Gerasimov, who stated that on the Kupyansk sector, Russian troops have blocked 5,000 Ukrainian soldiers, and in the Pokrovsk direction, the cauldron has closed, and in the blockade, in 2 cities, Pokrovsk and Menohrad, there are 5,500 soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine. That is, in total, according to the head of the Russian General Staff, more than 10,000 soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine are currently under blockade. We will examine these sectors with you and try to understand what is really happening there. And the second topic is the meat grinder on the Dobrailia salient, as the Ukrainian armed forces are now counterattacking there, and it must be admitted that they have achieved some success. But the Russian troops have also achieved certain successes. So we will analyze with you what is happening there. So let's start with Gerasimov's report. The Kupyansk direction. Are 5,000 Ukrainian soldiers blocked? In Kupyansk itself? Well, of course not. You know, even at the peak, when we were just starting the assault on Kupyansk, when we had just approached the city from the north, there weren't even close to 5,000 Ukrainian soldiers there. Now, in the center of the right bank, where you see on the map, there is indeed a blockade. Certain garrisons of the Ukrainian armed forces are indeed blocked in the center of the right bank, but their number is several hundred soldiers, not several thousand. So what was Gerasimov talking about then? He was talking about this whole pocket on the left bank of the Oskil River. This includes the left bank part of Kupyansk and the urban-type settlement of Kupyansk-Vuzlovyi and Kiev-Sharivka, and a number of other large settlements like Petropavlivka or Kurilivka. This is where you can find about 5,000 Ukrainian soldiers. The only question is, why does Gerasimov say that they are blocked when we see on the map that there is a pretty decent 14 kilometers wide exit corridor? Well, here, it's more likely not about a physical blockade, but about the fact that all crossings over the Oskil are now under Russian fire control. And this is true. These are not just words, not just someone's fantasies. The Ukrainian armed forces themselves are talking about this. They say that as soon as they set up a crossing, Russian troops immediately hit it, either with drones or with FABs. And they don't have time to set up crossings. They don't have time to cross, because everything, absolutely all of this space across the Oskil is controlled by our fire. And what does that mean? It means that they are trapped on the left bank. There are no supplies, and the exit is also difficult, although they are asking for an order to withdraw them from the left bank. And yesterday, information came out that Dobrailia, who was recently appointed to command here, did give the order to withdraw the Ukrainian armed forces from the left bank. But despite all these statements, I personally treat such information, well, let's say, with distrust. I'll explain why. Well, look, the area of the sector here is 200 square kilometers. That is, not 20, not 2, but 200 square kilometers. There are very well fortified settlements, like Kupyansk-Vuzlovyi or Kiev-Sharivka. Well, I don't believe that. You know, they will just give it up without a fight. But we'll see. Maybe such an order was indeed given. If it was given, in the near future, we will see the withdrawal of the Ukrainian armed forces from the left bank. Right now, Russian troops are trying to cut this cauldron, because 200 square kilometers is a lot. And they are trying to divide this whole cauldron into 2 cauldrons. And you see, here from Stepova Novoselivka, they have already advanced 10 kilometers in the direction of Kurilivka, and are now trying to fully secure an exit to the Oskil from these positions, so that there are 2 cauldrons isolated from each other, which will then be cleared. Let's move on to the Pokrovsk sector. Things are even sadder there for the armed forces of Ukraine. So the situation in Pokrovsk is approaching its finale, because a full-fledged offensive is already underway inside the city. So we have discussed the Kupyansk sector. To summarize, the Ukrainian armed forces are trapped on the left bank here, and our soldiers are now trying to cut this cauldron into two parts and begin to clear it. Now let's move on to the Pokrovsk direction. Yesterday, Gerasimov also reported to Putin that the soldiers of the Center Group had completed the operation to encircle Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad, and in the cauldron in these two cities there were 5,500 Ukrainian soldiers. That is, what is this about? That this bottleneck has closed. But I will say this, that so far there is no reliable data, or rather, it would be more correct to say, so far there are no objective control footage that this has indeed happened, that the bottleneck has closed, that the positions of the Pokrovsk and Rodinsky soldiers have met here. So far there is no such footage and no such data. But you know, I take it easier. Even if the bottleneck hasn't closed, even if they haven't physically connected, the Ukrainian armed forces are still surrounded here for the simple reason that you can't really get out through this narrow space. Well, listen, 5 kilometers is 2.5 kilometers from each side, a shooting gallery, nothing less. Especially now in modern warfare when there are drones. Well, even without drones, even if there were no drones, 5 kilometers. When again it's 2.5 kilometers here and 2.5 kilometers from this side, that's it, it's the end. You can't get through, even if you try, but 9 out of 10 soldiers will fall here. Because it's just completely shot through. That is why Gerasimov issued an ultimatum. Lay down your arms and surrender by the 27th, that is, by today. If this is not done, you have only yourselves to blame, as they say. Now regarding the numbers, are there 5,500 Ukrainian soldiers in this cauldron? Quite possible. I'll explain. At the peak, when we had just approached Pokrovsk, had not even begun to storm it, the Ukrainian armed forces garrison there numbered 10,000 soldiers. This is only in Pokrovsk. That is, there is also Mirnohrad. But only in Pokrovsk there were 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers. Well, it's clear that the situation has changed now because the Ukrainian armed forces no longer control half of Pokrovsk. It's either under Russian control here or it's a grey zone. Plus, I know for sure that part of the garrison was withdrawn when there was still such an opportunity. When the bottleneck was about 10 kilometers, some experienced Ukrainian soldiers were withdrawn from there. Plus, some were killed, some were captured. And plus, consider what's left in Pokrovsk, plus the Ukrainian armed forces garrison in Mirnohrad. So yes, approximately, 5,500 soldiers here is a completely realistic figure. Will they lay down their arms and surrender? Definitely not. I am more than sure that the ultimatum will be ignored, which means that the majority of the 5,500 Ukrainian soldiers will remain here forever. Now let's move on to the second topic of our episode, the Dobrailia sector. It's not easy here, let's say. There are head-on fierce battles. There are successes for both us and the Ukrainian armed forces. Regarding the successes of the Ukrainian armed forces, they were able to advance 3.5 kilometers and reach the area of suburban cottages. This is to the southeast of Vilna. This is where they have dug in. Everything they said about retaking several settlements, or how many did they say, 30 or 40 square kilometers of territory, it's all nonsense. But we are observing such a setback for us here. Again, the situation is difficult. There are head-on battles, a real seesaw here. Positions are changing hands, sometimes overlapping each other, sometimes I'll even tell you this. The soldiers told me this personally, that sometimes Russian positions and Ukrainian armed forces positions are mixed. Therefore, no one can tell you exactly where the line of contact is now, because sometimes they don't understand on the ground where exactly the line of contact is. But from what is known from objective control footage, from what we have seen, we know for sure that in this sector, the Russian troops have been pushed back by the Ukrainian armed forces. As for Russian successes, Russian troops managed to advance 2 kilometers and 200 meters and occupy part of Shakov. Yesterday there was footage of a Russian presence in the center of the village. And I have repeatedly told you that the capture of Shakov is a super important matter, because relying on this well-fortified settlement, the Russian troops will essentially stake their claim to the entire Dobrailia salient, and counterattacks will no longer be scary, at least not as scary. But for now, the fighting in Shakov continues, but Russian progress is clearly visible. We will monitor the development of events. What else can I say? Regarding Rodinsky, There is already objective control footage with a Russian flag in the center of the city. There is information that the 9th Brigade has taken control of the city. But I personally have no contact with the 9th Brigade, but I do have contact with their neighbors who are stationed here in Novi Ekonomichne. I asked them, and they, yes, confirmed that Rodinsky is most likely already fully controlled by the Russian army. But since there is little objective control data, almost no video footage, we will not rush to conclusions about the full, or rather with the announcement of the full 100% capture of Rodinsky for now. Let's wait for additional footage and additional information. And the last thing. Regarding the Dnipropetrovsk region, I have data from the ground that Russian troops have finished off Yehorivka. If you remember, I told you in one of the recent episodes that the soldiers were able to force the Yar Yanchur and enter the southern part of the village. So I was informed that they managed to drive the Ukrainian armed forces out of the center first, and yesterday towards evening from the northern part of the village. And now a full-fledged consolidation and clearing of the settlement is underway. Consequently, in the near future, I think tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, footage with Russian flags from the village should appear. And then it will be possible to speak with confidence about 100% control. In general, that's probably all for today on the situation at the front. Let's summarize. The situation on the Dobrailia salient is difficult, but this is nothing compared to the problems the Ukrainian armed forces have in the Pokrovsk cauldron and on the left bank of the Oskil River. But nevertheless, it's too early to rejoice, to celebrate. The battle for the same Pokrovsk continues. That's all from me on the front. Now let's move on to a review of the political situation. Joke of the day. Germany has sent a diplomatic note to Beijing over the ban on the export of microchips from China to Europe, writes Bild. Earlier, the Dutch government intervened in the activities of the chip manufacturer Nexperia, owned by the Chinese concern Wingtech, due to fears of losing a critically important technological base in Europe. In response, the Chinese authorities restricted the export of chips produced at the company's Chinese plant. And at the same time, Bild writes that no one wants to meet with Wadeful in China. German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul wanted to fly to China on Sunday, but the trip was cancelled at the last minute. The reason is that no one wanted to meet with the German minister in China. Instead of a meeting, Wadephul and his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi, will have a phone call sometime in the future. Merz has been heading the German government for almost half a year, but has not yet made a single visit to China since taking office. Days were reserved in the Chancellor's office calendar for a possible trip by Merz to China and India next week. However, according to rumors, Xi Jinping did not find time to receive Merz on these days. The office explained that the Chinese side could not confirm any meetings other than a meeting with the Chinese foreign minister. The cancellation of Johann Wadephul's visit to China is a foreign policy disaster for the Chancellor's government. At the same time, Macron decided to add his 2 cents. Macron proposed that the EU apply the toughest trade measure against China, writes Bloomberg. According to the agency, he called on EU leaders to consider all options, including a tool to combat Beijing's economic coercion. This mechanism has not been used before, and according to the publication, its application could increase tensions in relations between the EU and China. A phrase from the German Chancellor blew up Europe. A scandal erupted in Germany. Chancellor Friedrich Merz said that everyone understands the problem of street safety. Ask your daughters. Politicians and the media are arguing. Some talk about protecting women, while others talk about inciting fear. The story has already crossed the borders of Germany and is being discussed throughout Europe, including Italy. The speech was about the growing sense of insecurity in cities and about tough deportations for illegal immigrants. Journalists asked if he had gone too far. The answer came like a slap in the face. Ask your daughters. After that, a storm began. On social media, women are writing opposite stories. Some are afraid of street harassment. Others do not want their fears to be used against all migrants at once. German publications have collected the voices of girls of different ages. From "It's true, it's scarier in the evening" to "I'm not scared of passports, but of irresponsibility, the absence of law." The context is important. Merz's harsh words came against the backdrop of political competition with the right and talk of large-scale expulsions of irregular migrants. Critics see this as pandering to fears and xenophobia. Supporters talk about women's right to safety and the failure of previous policies. It seems the conversation is also going on in Italy, where there is a fine line between protecting order and labeling entire groups of people. European media note that in large cities, fear increases in the evening, and the state needs to regain trust. Police presence, functioning courts, clear rules for legal immigrants, and quick solutions for illegal ones. This is not only a German dilemma, it is a European one. The Financial Times stated that sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil would harm the US itself. Sanctions imposed by President Donald Trump as a lever of pressure on Moscow could harm the United States itself. This was stated in an interview with the British newspaper Financial Times by Amos Hochstein, managing partner of the investment company TWG Global. He pointed out that the United States would have to contain the rise in oil prices to avoid the consequences of its own restrictions. If prices rise significantly, this growth will compensate Russia for its losses from sanctions. And if prices rise too much, then not only will Russia benefit from this, but consumers in the US and American allies will lose, Hochstein believes. It was previously reported that other analysts predict the same. Russian President Vladimir Putin also said that the new sanctions would not significantly affect the country's economic well-being. But this is an unfriendly act towards Russia, and it does not strengthen Russian-American relations, which have only just begun to recover.